Today we're going to talk about The Call of the Wild by Jack London. So the author of The Call of the Wild was Jack London. He was born in 1876 and died in 1916. Now, he left school in California after the 8th grade, but he later returns to graduate from high school, and he only briefly attended Cal Berkeley before beginning a life of adventure. So some of his life adventures include going off and trying to be a pirate, tramping across the western part of the United States, trying out being a gold prospector up in Alaska, and also being a journalist for various wars towards the end of the 19th century for the United States. So when we talk about Jack London's works, he has White Fang, he has some of his short stories, like To Build a Fire, but The Call of the Wild is likely his most famous work. Now, these experiences that he had tramping across the western part of the United States, journaling for wars, and especially exploration up into Alaska, his time looking for gold in Canada as well, are usually seen in his stories. And his time looking for gold in Canada in the Yukon is seen in The Call of the Wild. Now, Jack London wrote over 50 books and was at one time the most popular writer in America. Now, when you take a look at his naturalist works, they focus on the exploration of new frontiers, including the American West. They are also going to celebrate the violence that came along at the time with that pioneering days, but they also celebrate the positivity of power and strength, the idea that people can overcome nature, or the idea that they can grow stronger in nature. So when we take a look at The Call of the Wild, the date of the publication was in 1903. Usually when we look at the genre, we look at the idea of American naturalism, but usually when you talk about genre, we're looking at an adventure story, maybe even perhaps a fable because your main character is a dog. The setting in the time is going to be in the late 1890s, and the setting for the place, you're going to start off in California very briefly, but then you're going to get transferred up into Canada and Alaska for most of your story. Now, these two regions that are diametrically opposed are also going to be discussed. Where Buck comes from, your main character, the dog, is from the Southland, from California, from the southern part of the North American hemisphere. And then he transfers up to the Northland, Canada and Alaska. So the former represents the civilization and the latter, the wild. Now, in the Southland, Buck lived a domesticated and a perfectly stable life. But when Buck arrives in the Northland, he realizes that survival is the only concern. So here we have a picture of North America, especially Canada and the United States. And so we take a look at where the Southland is. If you look on the western side, on the left-hand side of the map, you're seeing where it says WAORCA. CA stands for California, where Buck would be from, because that's Jack London's original home, California. And he was transferred by boat up to the Yukon Territory and up into Alaska, which is all the way on the top left of your map. So we take a look more at our literary focus. We'll start with the idea of The Call of the Wild being told from third person. But it's also told from a very unusual point of view, that of a dog. But you have this human narration that stands outside of Buck's consciousness, and it makes sense of the dog's universe to the human readers. So even though your main character and your point of view is coming from a dog, it still feels like you have human narration going on. And so then your protagonist is going to be Buck the dog, and the antagonist is going to be nature, how you have to survive in nature, man's nature and how he deals with the elements, and how we have this selfish, irresponsible owner who's looking for themselves first, and maybe not so much on the dog, and certainly not looking at nature as its own force. They're trying to tame it. So let's look at the characters. We're going to start with our main character, Buck. He's a powerful dog who seems to feel the call of the wild, the title of the story. Now, Buck is stolen from Judge Miller's California estate. and is sold off as a sled dog in the Arctic. Judge Miller is going to have no idea where his dog has gone. Buck is now an Alaskan dog. Buck evolves from a pampered pet into a fierce, masterful animal, a survivor in the cruel northern wilderness. And one of its first antagonists is going to be Spitz, a second dog. And the reason why we look at him as his arch rival is that he's this fierce devil dog who is used to winning fights with other dogs. He is the leader of the pack of dogs that Buck first joins. So eventually, when we get halfway through the book, around chapter 4, Spitz is going to be defeated and killed by Buck. It's not just going to be random, though. There's going to be several events that are going to happen where Buck starts antagonizing Spitz, and eventually there's going to be a showdown. It is very amoral and ruthless, where the dogs are literally fighting for their lives, and there are other dogs standing around and just letting it happen. You're also going to see other characters who maybe perhaps are not the most protagonist or the people who are going to be growing with you. For example, in chapter 6, you're going to meet Hal along with Mercedes and others who are American gold seekers. Buck's dog team is going to be bought by Hal in order for them to go seek gold. They're absolute terrible masters to the dog team. They've never had to go and seek gold before. They don't know how to survive in Canada. They certainly don't know how to take care of themselves or the dogs. And so Mercedes is going to be Hal's sister. The other person on that journey is Charles. She is Charles's wife. And she shows the absolute spoiled and pamperedness that would not gel well with the Alaskan wilderness at all. Matter of fact, Mercedes is the main key as to why this slows down the journey, and possibly the reason why, spoiler alert, something terrible might happen to the humans later in that chapter. The one redeeming quality that Mercedes may perhaps have is she does show some sympathy for the dogs. She realizes that it's such a terrible turn of events that have taken place in Alaska, and she realizes that the dogs are having just as a terrible time as the humans are. So we take a look at Charles, who's Mercedes' husband and Hal's brother-in-law. He's the older of the two, and he's just there to be this inexperienced, foolish owner. And John Thornton is going to come along and be Buck's final master. When he first meets up with Buck, Buck is in a terrible state along with the others in his pack. Buck is still owned by Hal, Charles, and Mercedes. And John cannot stand the mistreatment that Buck is getting. Literally threatens Hal with his life. He says, if you beat that dog again, I'm going to kill you. And literally cuts Buck out of the traces of the dog sled. Now, John Thornton is an experienced gold hunter. He knows the ways of the Klondike. He's been up in Alaska long enough to actually realize how to survive and how to do well in that area of Alaska. And so Buck is not only going to be able to recuperate with John Thornton, but John is going to almost in a way help Buck realize that the wild is a good place for Buck. Now, Thornton and Buck's relationship is an ideal for a human and animal in this particular survival experience. They're going to protect each other. They're going to be devoted to one another and make sure that not only does each other survive, but they're going to thrive in that environment in Alaska. Finally, we take a look at the literary focus. We might want to look at what this particular story is. One of the literary focuses you might be looking at is what's called an allegory. Now, an allegory tells two stories at once. One is going to be set in the reality of the story, but one is going to have a more symbolic significance. So when we look at one level of the story, we're going to be seeing how Buck is surviving different masters, how he's learning to live in Alaska. That's going to be more the realistic adventure side of the story. But you're also going to see how Buck is starting to answer the call of the wild. There's going to be times when he starts howling, when he starts realizing about the other dogs and their traits in the wilderness. He's no longer a Southland dog from California. He starts realizing what the call of the wild means to him. On a deeper level, however, the novel may be voicing London's opinion that man is inherently savage and only looks out for themselves, and like Buck, must learn to survive by any means necessary. You might also be looking at symbolism when it comes to some of the humans in the story. For example, Hal and his companions Mercedes and Charles are going to represent the weakness of civilized people and embody the worst kind of man-to-human relationship, where they're only concerned not just with themselves, but literally with themselves, not with other human beings around them. And so the dogs in the wilderness are going to become very secondary and tertiary to them. Mercedes is also going to be symbolic about how civilized women could perhaps be babied by the men and not be expected to help out in a survival situation, how she herself was unsuited for life in the wild. Finally, we look at the idea of themes and conflicts. Again, we have this sense of American naturalism coming through in the late 19th century in American literature, and certainly Jack London is a key component of that sense of naturalism, where we're looking at nature being powerful and man attempting to tame it. The sense of survival is also going to be a major theme in here, where Buck is learning how to create a new life for himself in a new environment. And there's also going to be the idea of survival of the fittest. How does he react when he has to fight Spitz in a dog versus dog kind of ideal? How is he going to survive when he's from the Southland and he's learning about the Northland? How do you live in the Yukon and Alaska? How do you survive when you have owners like Hal and Charles and Mercedes who can't even take care of themselves, let alone the dogs that they have? You're also going to see, again, that quest for alpha dog status and the sense of primitive instincts, where we start seeing Buck not only take over as a leader of the pack after Spitz's death, but he starts learning primitive instincts where one day, perhaps he might not need humans at all. And then finally, that sense of rugged individualism where, again, in the late 19th century in American literature, we see this sense of Americans being able to tame nature and a sense of being able to work hard and pull themselves up and be able to create something on their own, something that they did not need help from anyone else in order to achieve. And of course, that leads to one of the classic American literature themes, the idea of not only individualism, but the sense of freedom, where Buck now can be, at the end of the story, completely free from humanity, completely free from the Southland. He can make his own decisions. He can live free without anybody else, not a dog pack, not humans. He needs nothing but himself. And then lastly, with the idea of civilization versus nature, that's a very big conflict throughout the story where he feels he needs the humans in order to live, even when he has John Thornton as his owner, and he's very devoted to John Thornton. We start seeing in Chapter 8 and even the beginning of Chapter 9 towards the end of the story how civilization is breaking away completely from Buck and how nature has been calling. The call of the wild has been telling the dog, this is where you belong. Not with civilization, not even with the human, with the man that you are love and devoted to. Nature's going to win out in the end for your main character. Now, there are some influences that you might see in Jack London's writing. For example, the 19th century authors of Charles Darwin and Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche is a German philosopher who said there were two types of human beings, the masters who have a will to be powerful, and the slaves who do not have that same desire. And so when we look at that ideal of Buck, first of all, knowing that there has to be a human master and that he should not have that desire to master himself, that might perhaps be coming across as an influence. We also have this envisionment of a natural world that is defined by fierce competition for scarce resources up in Alaska. And so Buck's going to have to learn to fend for himself, that survival of the fittest that Charles Darwin, the English philosopher, would have brought up. And then Darwin's theory can be simplified into that idea of the survival of the fittest. So once again, an overview of Jack London's The Call of the Wild. Buck is a powerful dog. He's a mix of a St. Bernard and a sheepdog. So at the beginning of the story already, he does have good survival skills. Gold is discovered in the Klondike region of Canada, and Buck is sold off to dog traders, so there is a reason why he is being put into this nature setting. Buck, who had grown used to the sunny weather of California, is absolutely shocked by the harsh conditions of the North. He'd never seen snow before. He had no idea how to be a sled dog. He didn't understand that there could be a society where there might be more dogs than humans, and dogs are expected to work, say perhaps as he'd seen the horses in California work. Buck, however, becomes adept. He, in every environment, in every single chapter where he goes from owner to owner to owner and finally in freedom itself, he becomes adept and learns to start trusting his nature side, his animalistic nature. And then soon he becomes lead dog for his team. And then once he's past being a leader of the pack, he becomes a leader with John Thornton's small group. And then eventually he becomes a lead dog for the pack of wolves that he finds in the forest. Now, on one of Buck's journeys, his inexperienced masters ignore the dangers of the wilderness. I believe that would be Hal, Charles, and Mercedes. And with the help of the gold hunter John Thornton, Buck is freed from his irresponsible owners, and then he becomes completely devoted to Thornton. So you're going to see Buck saving John Thornton's life on more than one occasion. But Buck's affection for Thornton is tempered because he's increasingly drawn to the call of the wild. So the second half of the book, you start seeing Buck being drawn away from civilization. Once a dog of leisure, Buck has also developed into an animal that is completely one with nature. He was completely comfortable sitting in front of Judge Miller's fire in California, but the time you get halfway through the book, he now is completely comfortable with the nature of survival of the fittest and with physical nature as well. Well, that is Jack London's Call of the Wild. If you have any other questions about Jack London or his other stories, please leave a comment down below. Let me know what other books you'd like to see from me. And as always, I'd be happy if you subscribed. Thanks for stopping by.